I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear her voice calling my name from across the creek. 7 years have passed since that October morning when my twin sister Lily vanished without a trace, but time hasn't dulled the sharp edges of that day. The creek behind our family's ranch still runs the same path it always has, winding through cottonwoods and over smooth river stones. But everything changed the day those waters took her from me. My name is Rose, and I'm 23 now, though I feel decades older. People say twins share a special bond, something deeper than regular siblings. They say we feel each other's pain, know each other's thoughts. If that were true, wouldn't I have known the moment she needed me? Wouldn't I have felt her fear, her desperation, her final moments? The morning she disappeared started like any other. October frost painted the grass silver, and our breath made little clouds in the crisp air. Mama was inside preparing breakfast while Papa checked on the cattle in the far pasture. Lily and I were supposed to gather eggs from the hen house, but she wanted to play by the creek first. Just for a few minutes, Rosie, she'd said, clutching her favorite doll, a cloth figure with yellow yarn hair that Mama had sewn for her 6th birthday. The doll wore a tiny blue dress with white buttons, and Lily had named her Belle. That doll went everywhere with her, shared every secret, every adventure. I should have said no, should have insisted we do our chores first. But Lily had this way of lighting up when she talked about the creek, how the water sang different songs depending on the season. She said autumn made the prettiest music of all, with leaves dancing on the surface like nature's own symphony. We walked hand in hand down the familiar path, our boots crunching through fallen leaves. The creek was running higher than usual from recent rains, rushing and gurgling over the rocks with more force than we were used to. The cottonwoods stood like sentinels along the banks, their golden leaves catching the early morning light. Lily let go of my hand and ran toward the water's edge. Belle clutched tight against her chest. She loved to sit on the old fallen log that stretched partway across the creek, dangling her feet in the cool water. That log had been our special place since we could walk, worn smooth by countless hours of sitting and dreaming. "Be careful, Lily," I called after her, but she was already settling onto the log with Belle in her lap. The doll's blue dress spread out like tiny flower petals against Lily's brown skirt. She began humming one of the songs Mama used to sing to us, her voice mixing with the sound of rushing water. I gathered some smooth stones from the bank, planning to skip them across the wider part of the creek downstream. The water was too rough near the log for stone skipping, but there was a calmer pool about 20 yards away. I could still see Lily from there, still hear her humming. When I looked up from selecting the perfect flat stone, she was gone. The log sat empty, water rushing past it like nothing had changed. Belle lay on the muddy bank, her blue dress dark with creek water, one small arm reaching toward the stream as if she'd tried to follow. I screamed her name until my voice cracked, until Papa came running from the pasture with his face white as winter. We searched every inch of that creek, every fallen tree that might have caught her, every deep pool where she might have gone under. The whole town turned out to help. Neighbors, strangers, anyone with strong arms and good eyes. For 3 days we walked the creek bed, following its path for miles downstream. We found nothing, no piece of clothing, no sign of struggle, no trace that my sister had ever existed except for Belle, left behind on that muddy bank like a witness to something unspeakable. The sheriff said sometimes the creek takes people and doesn't give them back. Said the current was stronger than it looked, especially for a small girl. But I knew my sister. She was careful around water, respectful of the creek's power. She wouldn't have leaned too far or taken foolish risks. Mama never recovered from that day. She aged 10 years in 10 weeks, her hair going grey and her smile disappearing like morning frost. Papa threw himself into ranch work, rising before dawn and working until dark, as if exhaustion could somehow silence the questions that haunted us all. And I became the twin who lived, carrying the weight of two lives, wondering every day why the creek chose to take her instead of me, why it left me behind to remember, to search, to hope against hope that someday the water would give back what it had stolen. The funeral was held without a body, which felt wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. Pastor Jenkins spoke about faith and God's mysterious ways, but his words felt hollow as autumn wind through bare branches. We buried an empty coffin next to Grandpa Joe with a headstone that read, "Lily May Patterson, beloved daughter and sister, gone too soon." I stood between Mama and Papa in my black dress, the one Mama had sewn for church socials, now pressed into service for grief. The whole town seemed to be there. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the Carlson family from the neighboring ranch, even old Tom Bradley, who rarely left his cabin except for supplies. Everyone kept saying how sorry they were, how they couldn't imagine our pain. But their words felt like stones thrown into a deep well. You hear them hit, but they disappear into darkness. What I wanted to scream was that sorry wouldn't bring Lily back, wouldn't fill the empty space in our house, wouldn't stop me from setting 2 plates at breakfast every morning. After the service, people gathered at our house with covered dishes and hushed conversations. I escaped to the creek, carrying Belle with me like I had every day since Lily disappeared. The doll's dress was clean now. Mama had washed and mended it with trembling hands, but I could still see water stains if I looked close enough. I sat on our log, the same spot where Lily had been that morning, and talked to Belle like she could somehow carry my words to wherever my sister had gone. I told her about the funeral, about how Mama cried so hard Papa had to hold her up, about how the house felt too big and too quiet now. The creek kept flowing, indifferent to our grief, carrying leaves and twigs toward some distant destination. I wondered if Lily had made it that far, if she was somewhere downstream waiting for us to find her. The thought of her cold and alone in some dark pool made me sick to my stomach. Winter came early that year, freezing the creek solid for the first time in my memory. I took it as a sign. Maybe the water was sorry for what it had done. Maybe it was holding still so we could search more carefully. But when spring came and the ice melted, we found nothing new, just more smooth stones and drifting debris. Mama started talking about selling the ranch, moving to town where she wouldn't have to see the creek every day. But Papa wouldn't hear of it. This land had been in his family for 3 generations. And besides, what if Lily came back? What if she was lost somewhere and finally found her way home to an empty house? I started my own rituals of remembrance. Every morning I'd visit the creek with Belle, sitting on our log and telling my sister about the day ahead. Every evening I'd return with news of what had happened, who came to visit, what Mama cooked for dinner, how the cattle were doing. The doll became my connection to Lily, the only physical proof that she had existed beyond memories that seemed to fade a little more each day. Belle's cloth body held the shape of my sister's arms, and sometimes I swore I could still smell Lily's soap in the yarn hair. School started again in September, but I couldn't concentrate on lessons about arithmetic and geography when my sister was missing. The other children whispered when they thought I couldn't hear, creating their own theories about what had happened. Some said she'd run away. Others claimed she'd been taken by wild animals or wandering desperados. Miss Patricia, our teacher, tried to be kind, but her pity felt like another burden to carry. She'd give me easier assignments and speak to me in the soft voice people use around broken things. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't broken, just changed, but I didn't have words for the difference. The worst part was the silence at home. We'd always been a family that talked through everything. Problems with the ranch, plans for the future, silly jokes that made no sense to anyone else. Now we moved around each other like ghosts, afraid that speaking Lily's name might make the loss too real to bear. But I spoke her name every day by the creek, whispered it to Belle in the darkness of my room, carried it with me like a prayer or a promise. Lily May Patterson, my twin sister, my other half. I would not let her become a silence. At night, I'd lie in the bed we used to share, staring at the empty space where she should be. Sometimes I'd reach across expecting to touch her shoulder, to wake her for a midnight conversation about dreams or fears. Instead, I'd find cold sheets and the hollow ache of absence. Papa aged that first year, his shoulders stooping under the weight of unanswered questions. He'd stand at the kitchen window every morning with his coffee, staring out at the creek like he expected to see her walking up the path. Mama would watch him watching, and I'd watch them both, all of us trapped in our separate versions of waiting. The seasons turned as they always had, but everything felt different now. Spring brought wildflowers that Lily would never pick. Summer meant swimming holes we'd never share again. Autumn returned with the same golden light that had blessed her last morning, making every October day a reminder of loss. By the time I turned 17, I'd learned to navigate the world as a single person instead of half of a pair. It wasn't natural. Twins aren't meant to be alone. But necessity taught me how to make decisions without checking with Lily first. How to have thoughts that weren't immediately shared with another mind. The town had mostly stopped talking about the disappearance, filing it away as one of those tragic mysteries that sometimes happen to good families. New babies were born. Other families faced their own troubles, and life moved forward like water around a stone. But I remained stuck in that October morning, forever 17 while my body grew older. I took over more responsibilities on the ranch as Papa's strength began to fail. The years of searching, of hoping, of carrying guilt had worn him down like wind on sandstone. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and sometimes I'd catch him staring at nothing, lost in memories of a daughter who used to help him with morning chores. Mama found solace in the church, spending hours praying for Lily's soul and for the strength to accept God's will. She organized charitable work for other families in need, as if helping others might somehow balance the scales of her own loss. But I could see the effort it cost her, the way she had to force smiles and manufacture hope. I still visited the creek every day, still carried Belle with me like a talisman. The doll was showing her age now. 7 years of daily handling had worn her yarn hair thin and faded her blue dress to a soft grey. But she remained my constant companion, the keeper of secrets I couldn't tell anyone else. Sometimes young men from town would come calling, bringing flowers or invitations to church socials. They were kind enough boys with clean shirts and nervous smiles, but I couldn't imagine sharing my life with someone who hadn't known Lily. How could I explain the empty chair at every meal, the one-sided conversations by the creek, the way I still bought 2 hair ribbons at the general store out of habit? The creek itself had become both sanctuary and torment. I knew every bend, every deep pool, every fallen log along its banks. In dry summers, I could walk its entire bed, searching for any sign that might have been uncovered. In wet springs, I'd watch it rage past our property, wondering what secrets it carried toward the distant river. I started keeping a journal, writing letters to Lily about daily life on the ranch. I told her about the new calf born in spring, about Mama's garden and Papa's struggles with his back. I described the changing seasons, the neighbors' news, the way the sunrise painted the cottonwoods, different colors each morning. The writing helped, somehow. It gave purpose to the small details of existence, made me notice things I might have overlooked, the way frost formed different patterns on the windows each winter morning, how the creek sang different songs depending on how much water it carried, the exact shade of gold the wheat turned before harvest. Mrs. Henderson at the general store started saving books for me, stories about far-off places and adventures I'd never have. Reading became an escape from the endless questions that had no answers. In those pages, I could be someone else entirely, someone whose sister hadn't vanished without a trace. But even in fiction, I found myself drawn to stories about siblings, about loyalty and loss, about people searching for something they could never find. The books reflected back my own longing, my own impossible hope that somehow, somewhere, Lily was reading the same words and thinking of me. The seasons blurred together into a pattern of remembrance and routine. Each October brought the anniversary of her disappearance, marked by a special service at church and fresh flowers on her empty grave. Each spring renewal felt like a betrayal. How could the world be reborn when my sister remained lost? I learned to carry grief like other people carry family photos, always present but tucked away, brought out for special occasions or when someone asked the right questions. Most days I could function normally, helping with ranch work and household chores, making conversation with neighbors about weather and crops. But the creek remained my confession booth, the place where I could admit how tired I was of being the twin who lived, where I could voice the terrible thought that sometimes visited in dark moments, that maybe it should have been me who disappeared that morning. Maybe Lily would have been stronger, better able to carry the weight of survival. Belle listened to everything without judgment, her button eyes holding whatever secrets I needed to share. She'd become more than a doll. She was proof that Lily had existed, evidence of her laughter and love, and the games we used to play. As long as Belle remained, part of my sister lived on. The ranch hands changed over the years, young men who'd never known Lily and saw me simply as the boss's daughter. They were respectful but distant, perhaps sensing the sadness that clung to our family like morning fog. They did their work and collected their wages and went home to families that were whole. When I turned 20, I decided to expand my search beyond our little creek. Papa was too weak to object, and Mama had retreated so far into her prayers that she barely noticed my comings and goings. I packed supplies and started following the water downstream, mapping every mile between our ranch and the river junction 15 miles away. I'd ride out at dawn with Belle tucked safely in my saddlebag, returning before dark with mud on my boots and disappointment in my heart. The creek wound through 3 other properties before reaching the main river, and I got permission from each family to search their land. Most were sympathetic. Everyone remembered the little Patterson girl who'd vanished. The Weatherby place was first, about 2 miles downstream from us. Old Man Weatherby had helped with the original search, and he welcomed me back with coffee and careful questions about how my parents were holding up. His section of the creek ran through open pasture, easier to search, but offering fewer places where someone might rest or hide. Next came the Morrison Ranch, where the creek curved through dense woodland before emerging into their hayfields. Mrs. Morrison was a young mother with 3 small children, and the sight of them playing in her kitchen made my heart ache with what might have been. She packed me sandwiches and wished me luck, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that children could disappear without warning. The furthest ranch belonged to the Kellys, an Irish family who'd settled there just before the disappearance. They barely knew our story, but they listened with grave faces and opened their land to my searching. Their creek section was the wildest, cutting through rocky canyon walls that created deep pools and hidden overhangs. I spent weeks exploring every possibility, wading through cold water that numbed my legs and soaked through my heaviest boots. I found animal bones bleached white by sun and weather, rusted tin cans from campers or travelers, pieces of farm equipment that had been lost or abandoned, but no trace of a little girl in a brown skirt. The river junction was my final destination, the place where our familiar creek joined the larger waterway that eventually reached the state capital. Standing at that confluence, I felt the futility of my search settle on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. If Lily had made it this far, she could be anywhere along hundreds of miles of river. But I kept searching anyway, because stopping would mean accepting that she was truly gone. I learned to read the water like Papa read the sky for weather, understanding how current worked, where debris collected, how flooding changed the landscape. I became an expert in the geography of loss. Some days, I'd find items that made my heart race, a piece of brown fabric, a child's shoe, anything that might connect to that October morning, but nothing ever matched, nothing ever led to answers. The creek kept its secrets locked away beneath moving water and accumulated sediment. I started talking to other people who'd lost family members to accidents or disappearances. There was a surprising number of them. Mrs. Chen, whose husband had been thrown from his horse and never found. The Robbins family, whose teenage son had gone hunting and never returned. Old Pete Sullivan, whose daughter had died in a fire, but whose body was never recovered. We formed an informal community of the searching, bound together by the terrible understanding that some questions have no answers. We'd share information about search techniques, about how to read water and terrain, about how to keep hope alive when logic said it was time to let go. The physical searching was exhausting, but it was better than sitting still with my thoughts. Each day spent following the creek was a day I'd done something active about finding Lily. Even if I found nothing, at least I'd tried. At least I'd honored our bond by refusing to give up. Belle became my searching companion, her cloth body absorbing creek water and prairie dust as we covered mile after mile together. Sometimes I'd prop her against a rock while I searched a particularly difficult section, and her button eyes would watch over me like tiny guardians. She'd seen more of the countryside than most people in our county. Papa worried about me spending so much time alone in wild country, but he understood the need to search. Sometimes he'd saddle up and ride out to check on me, bringing fresh supplies and news from home. Those visits were precious. Moments when we could talk about Lily openly, sharing memories and theories without the weight of Mama's grief pressing down on us. The seasons marked my progress downstream. Spring searching meant wildflowers blooming along the banks and clear water that let me see the bottom. Summer brought low water that exposed hidden pools and underwater obstacles, but also rattlesnakes and scorching heat that made long searches dangerous. Fall was hardest, bringing back memories of that October morning with painful clarity. But it was also when the water ran clearest, when fallen leaves hadn't yet clouded the pools. I'd search with extra intensity during those autumn days, as if the anniversary itself might reveal what had been hidden. Winter forced me to stop, ice making the creek impassable and snowdrifts blocking the trails. Those were the longest months, sitting by the fire with Belle in my lap, planning the next year's search while knowing that each passing season made discovery less likely. But I couldn't stop. Stopping would mean admitting that my sister was gone forever, that the creek had won, that there was no hope of ever understanding what had happened that morning. As long as I kept searching, part of Lily remained alive in possibility. By my 21st birthday, I'd searched every accessible mile of creek between our ranch and the state capital. I'd mapped underwater snags, catalogued wildlife patterns, and could predict seasonal changes with the accuracy of a meteorologist. The creek had become my life's work, my obsession, my daily pilgrimage to the altar of unanswered questions. Mama had given up trying to redirect my energies toward marriage or moving away. She watched me leave each morning, with Belle tucked in my jacket pocket, and she welcomed me home each evening with the resigned patience of someone who'd learned that grief follows its own timeline. Her prayers had shifted from asking for Lily's return to asking for my peace. Papa's health continued to decline, his heart worn out from years of worry and guilt. Dr. Mackenzie said it wasn't uncommon for parents to sicken after losing a child. The body sometimes gave up when the spirit had carried too much sorrow. But Papa still insisted on checking the cattle each morning, moving slower but maintaining his routines. The ranch itself was struggling. Without Papa's full attention, and with me spending so much time searching, we'd had to sell off cattle and let some fields go fallow. The hired hands did their best, but a ranch needs its owners present and focused. Money became tight, and Mama started taking in sewing work to help make ends meet. I felt guilty about my searching expeditions, but I couldn't stop. It was as if Lily herself was calling me to keep looking, to refuse the easy comfort of acceptance. Sometimes at night I'd dream of her voice carried on creek water, urgent and frightened, begging me not to give up. I'd wake with wet cheeks and Belle clutched against my chest. The searching had changed me physically too. My hands were permanently stained with creek mud, my boots never quite dried out, and my skin was weathered from constant exposure to sun and wind. I looked older than my years, marked by purpose and disappointment in equal measure. But I'd also become something unusual, a woman who knew the land, like men knew cattle or horses. I could read water conditions, predict weather from cloud formations, and navigate by stars when searches ran late. The wilderness had taught me skills that would have seemed impossible when I was still half of a matched pair. Other searchers started consulting me about techniques and locations. When the Miller boy went missing near the river junction, his family asked me to help coordinate the search. I brought Belle with me and spent 3 days mapping the area, eventually finding him sheltered in a cave, hungry and scared, but alive. It was the first happy ending I'd been part of in years. That success brought more requests for help. Missing livestock, lost travelers, children who'd wandered away from picnics. People began to see me as someone who understood how to find what was lost. I never charged for my help, considering it practice for the day I'd finally find what mattered most. But each successful search reminded me of my own failure. I could find other people's missing loved ones, could read signs and follow trails that led to joyful reunions. Yet my own sister remained as lost as ever, leaving me to wonder what I was missing, what crucial sign I'd overlooked. The creek itself seemed to mock my efforts, flowing past our ranch day after day with the same indifferent persistence. It carried away leaves and debris, carved new channels during spring floods, froze solid in the hardest winters. But it never gave up its secret, never offered the smallest clue about what had happened that October morning. I started leaving offerings at the creek, not to any god or spirit, but to the water itself. Wildflowers that Lily had loved, smooth stones arranged in patterns, sometimes a verse from her favorite songs written on bark and set on the current. It felt foolish, but it also felt necessary, like maintaining a conversation with someone who couldn't answer back. Belle's condition reflected the years of searching. Her blue dress was grey now, patched with fabric from my own clothes when the original material finally gave way. Her yarn hair had thinned to wispy strands, and one button eye had been replaced with a pearl button from Mama's sewing box. But she remained my constant companion, the keeper of Lily's memory. The town had largely forgotten about the search, filing it away as Rose Patterson's peculiar obsession. Children pointed at me when I rode through on supply runs, whispering about the strange woman who talked to dolls and spent her days wandering creek beds. Their parents hushed them, but I could see the mixture of pity and judgment in their faces. New families had moved into the area, people who'd never known Lily and saw me only as an oddity. They were kind but distant, unsure how to relate to someone whose life had frozen in place while theirs moved forward. I felt like a character from one of my books, trapped in a story that everyone else had finished reading. But I couldn't move forward. Couldn't close the book on Lily's disappearance. Somewhere in the miles of creek I'd searched, in the seasonal patterns I'd memorized, in the accumulated knowledge of 7 years spent looking, there had to be an answer. I just hadn't found the right question yet. The approaching anniversary of her 8th year missing felt different somehow, weighted with significance I couldn't name. October was coming again, bringing the golden light and crisp air that had blessed and cursed that morning when my world changed forever. The morning of October 15th dawned clear and cold, exactly like the day Lily disappeared 8 years earlier. I woke before sunrise, as I always did on the anniversary, and dressed in the same brown skirt and white blouse I'd worn that morning as a 10-year-old girl. They barely fit now, but wearing them felt like honoring something sacred. Belle sat on my dresser, her faded dress and thinning hair making her look as weathered as I felt. I picked her up gently, cradling her against my chest the way Lily used to do. Today, we would walk the same path, sit on the same log, and remember the last moments before everything changed. Mama was already in the kitchen. moving slowly in the dim light. She'd aged terribly in the past year, her hair now completely white and her hands shaking with palsy that the doctor couldn't cure. She looked up when I entered, taking in my outfit with eyes that held too much understanding. "You look just like her," she whispered, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that felt like paper. "And my little Lily, always so serious about everything." For a moment I thought she was confusing me with my sister, but then she pulled her hand back and shook her head. "I'm sorry, Rose. This day makes me remember things wrong." Papa was still sleeping, his breathing labored and uneven. The doctor had warned us that his heart was failing, that we should prepare for the inevitable. But he'd insisted on living to see this anniversary, as if marking the 8th year might somehow bring closure or peace. I made coffee and toast, but neither Mama nor I could eat. We sat at the kitchen table watching the sunrise paint the cottonwoods gold, both of us remembering another October morning when 4 Patterson family members had shared breakfast instead of 2. At exactly the same time Lily and I had left the house 8 years ago, I walked out the back door with Belle in my arms. The frost was heavier this year, turning every blade of grass into crystal, and my breath made clouds in air that felt sharp enough to cut. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, as if time had folded back on itself. The path to the creek was worn smooth by 8 years of daily visits, my footsteps having carved a permanent trail through prairie grass and fallen leaves. I walked slowly, trying to recreate the casual pace Lily and I had maintained that morning, talking about nothing important and everything precious. The cottonwoods were in full autumn glory, their leaves catching the early light like scattered gold coins. A few had already fallen, creating a carpet that crunched under my boots with the same sound I remembered from that long-ago October. Even the air smelled the same, crisp and clean with hints of wood smoke from distant chimneys. I reached the creek bank and stopped, looking at the fallen log where Lily had sat for the last time. 8 years of weather had smoothed it even more, but it remained solid and welcoming, stretched partway across water that still ran clear and cold. I settled onto its familiar surface, arranging my skirt just as my sister had done. Belle felt heavier than usual in my arms, weighted with years of carrying hope and memory. I smoothed her grey dress and adjusted her remaining button eye, trying to see her as Lily had, not as a worn toy, but as a cherished companion worthy of secrets and adventures. The creek sang its autumn song, water rushing over stones with the musical quality that had always captivated Lily. I closed my eyes and listened, trying to hear what she had heard, trying to understand what had drawn her to this spot, despite the obvious dangers of high water and slippery rocks. I began to hum the song Lily had been singing that morning, one of Mama's lullabies about birds flying home to their nests. My voice cracked on the familiar melody, emotion making it hard to maintain the tune. But I kept humming, feeling closer to my sister than I had in months. When I opened my eyes, something was different about the creek. The water level seemed lower than usual for October, revealing rocks and debris that were normally hidden. 8 years of drought and overuse by upstream ranchers had reduced the flow to a fraction of what it had been during Lily's childhood. I slipped off the log and waded into the water, my boots immediately filling with cold that made my feet ache. But the reduced depth meant I could see bottom clearly, could examine areas that had been underwater during all my previous searches. Maybe the drought was finally revealing secrets the creek had kept hidden. Working methodically downstream from the log, I examined every visible stone, every piece of driftwood, every shadow that might conceal something significant. The water was so clear I could count individual pebbles on the bottom, could see minnows darting between submerged branches. About 50 yards downstream, where the creek curved around a stand of willows, something caught my eye. Wedged between 2 large rocks in what was normally a deep pool, something blue was visible through the shallow water. My heart began racing as I waded closer. Belle clutched tightly against my chest. It was fabric, blue fabric that looked remarkably familiar, but as I reached for it, my hand shaking with anticipation and dread, I realized it was too small to be clothing, too perfectly preserved after 8 years underwater, too recognizable to be anything other than what I'd been looking for without knowing it, a doll's dress, blue with white buttons, exactly like the one Belle wore. But this dress was different, darker blue, and somehow both more faded and better preserved than Belle's worn garment. As I lifted it from the water, I saw that it was attached to something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The doll that emerged from the creek was Belle's twin in every way except preservation. Where Belle showed 8 years of loving wear, this doll looked almost new, her blue dress still vibrant, her yellow yarn hair thick and bright, her button eyes clear and perfectly matched. She was exactly as Belle had been on the morning Lily disappeared, as if time had stopped for her underwater. I stood knee-deep in the creek, holding both dolls against my chest, while my mind struggled to understand what I was seeing. This wasn't Belle. Belle was right here in my arms, weathered and worn from years of companionship. But this was identical to how Belle had looked that October morning, identical to the doll Lily had been holding when she vanished. The implications hit me like ice water. If this doll had been in the creek for 8 years, if it had somehow been preserved in that pocket of still water between the rocks, then it meant Lily had been here. It meant she had dropped or lost this perfect double of Belle at some point during her disappearance. But how could there be 2 identical dolls? Mama had made Belle specially for Lily's 6th birthday, cutting the pattern herself and sewing every seam by hand. She'd used fabric scraps from her own sewing box, yarn from Mrs. Henderson's store, buttons saved from an old dress. There had been only one Belle, only one doll like this in the entire world, unless Lily had found this one somewhere. Unless she'd discovered a doll so similar to Belle that she'd claimed it as a sister, a twin companion for her beloved toy. Children did things like that, created elaborate stories to explain coincidences, built fantasy worlds around simple discoveries. I climbed out of the creek and sat on the bank, examining both dolls in the growing daylight. The one from the water was indeed different in subtle ways. The blue dress was a slightly different shade, the buttons were pearl instead of shell, the yarn hair was a lighter yellow. But the overall effect was so similar that from a distance they could easily be mistaken for the same doll. My hands shook as I turned the waterlogged doll over, looking for any clue about its origin. The fabric was of good quality, the stitching neat and even. This wasn't a cheap store-bought toy, but something made with care, made with love. Someone had put the same attention into creating this doll that Mama had put into Belle. A memory surfaced from years of searching. Something Mrs. Morrison had said about the family who'd lived on her ranch before she bought it. An older couple who'd lost their own daughter to illness, who'd moved away heartbroken and never returned. They'd left quickly, she'd said, leaving behind furniture and personal items they couldn't bear to pack. What if this doll had belonged to that lost daughter? What if Lily had found it somewhere along the creek, washed down from the abandoned homestead, or left behind in some childhood hiding place? What if she'd been carrying both dolls that morning, planning to surprise me with the discovery of Belle's twin? The scenario began to build in my mind like a story from one of my books. Lily finding the doll upstream, perhaps in a cache of toys left by the previous family's daughter, her excitement at the discovery, her eagerness to share it with me, her decision to bring both dolls to the creek, planning to reveal the surprise after our morning play session. Then something had gone wrong. Maybe she'd leaned too far over the water, trying to wash the newly found doll clean. Maybe she'd lost her balance, reaching for something else, dropping both dolls as she fell. Maybe she'd managed to save Belle, but not the other, watching her new treasure disappear into the current. But where was Lily herself? If she'd fallen in, if she'd been swept away by the high water, wouldn't we have found some trace of her downstream? Wouldn't her body have surfaced somewhere in all the miles I'd searched over 8 years? I looked at Belle, my constant companion through years of searching, and felt a new understanding wash over me. Belle had been muddy that morning, found on the creek bank with her dress soaked. I'd always assumed she'd been dropped when Lily fell in. But what if Belle had been thrown to safety? What if Lily had sacrificed her own chance of rescue to save her beloved doll? The thought broke my heart and mended it at the same time. It was so like Lily to think of Belle first, to make sure her cherished companion was safe even in her own moment of danger. I stood up slowly, cradling both dolls against my chest, and began walking upstream. If Lily had found this second doll somewhere along the creek, there might be other clues at the source. After 8 years of searching downstream, maybe I'd been looking in the wrong direction all along. The Morrison property extended about a mile upstream from our ranch, and I'd searched their section many times over the years, but I'd always focused on the creek itself, not the surrounding land where an abandoned homestead might have left traces. Today felt different, though. Today I had a new piece of the puzzle. As I walked, I found myself talking to both dolls, addressing them as Belle and her sister. It felt natural, like acknowledging a truth I'd always known, but never admitted. Lily would have named the second doll immediately, would have created an entire history for where she'd come from and why they were meant to be together. The upstream section of the creek ran through denser woodland, cottonwoods giving way to scrub oaks and wild plums. The water was even shallower here, barely ankle-deep in most places. If there had been a homestead nearby, this would have been the logical place to get water for household use. About half a mile upstream from our property line, I found what I was looking for, hidden behind a thicket of wild roses and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The remains of a stone foundation marked where a small house had once stood. Wildflowers grew through the gaps in the stones, and young trees had sprouted from what had once been a swept dirt floor. I pushed through the thorny undergrowth, ignoring the scratches on my arms and the tears in my skirt. This had to be where the previous family had lived, where their daughter had played with her doll before illness took her away. Somewhere in this forgotten place, Lily had made a discovery that changed everything. The foundation was small, just 2 rooms, probably built by settlers who'd arrived with more hope than money. I could see where a fireplace had been, where a door had opened toward the creek. It would have been a simple life, but probably a happy one until tragedy struck. I searched the area methodically, looking for any sign of where toys might have been left behind. Near what had been the back of the house, I found a depression in the ground that could have been a root cellar or storage area. When I cleared away years of accumulated leaves and debris, I discovered a wooden box buried just below the surface. The box was rotted and falling apart, but it had protected its contents from the worst of the weather. Inside, I found treasures that made my throat tighten with emotion: a child's cup, a wooden horse with a broken leg, and a piece of blue fabric that matched the doll's dress exactly. These were the belongings of the daughter who died, carefully buried by parents who couldn't bear to throw them away, but couldn't stand to take them either. Among the small toys and mementos, I found something else: a letter written in a woman's careful handwriting. The paper was water-stained and fragile, but I could make out most of the words. For whoever finds these things, they belonged to our daughter Sarah, who died of fever in her 7th year. She loved her doll, Mary, and her wooden animals. If you have children, please let them play with these toys. Sarah would have wanted other children to be happy. Mary, the doll's name had been Mary, and she'd belonged to a little girl named Sarah who died at almost the same age Lily had disappeared. The parallel was heartbreaking and somehow comforting at the same time. 2 little girls, 2 beloved dolls, separated by years, but connected by the timeless bond between child and cherished toy. I could imagine Lily's excitement at discovering this buried treasure, this collection of toys left behind by another little girl. She would have understood immediately that these weren't abandoned possessions, but sacred trust, meant to bring joy to someone new. She would have claimed Mary as Belle's sister and planned to honor Sarah's memory by giving the doll love and adventures. But something had gone wrong that morning. Whether it was accident or fate, water or misadventure, Lily had joined Sarah in whatever place little girls go when they leave this world too soon. The thought should have been devastating, but instead it brought a strange peace. I gathered the toys carefully, wrapping them in my shawl like precious relics. Along with Belle and Mary, they represented a connection between past and present, between two families who'd known loss and love in equal measure. Lily had found what she was looking for that morning, not just a doll, but a sister spirit who understood the importance of being cherished. Walking back toward home, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd solved the mystery of Lily's disappearance. I still didn't know exactly what had happened that October morning, but I finally understood why she'd been at the creek, what had drawn her to the water, despite the dangers we'd all warned her about. She'd been on a mission of love, carrying Mary back to Belle so the two dolls could be reunited after years of separation. In Lily's mind, they'd been meant to be together, two halves of a whole that had been broken by circumstance and tragedy. She'd been trying to heal something that had been damaged, to bring happiness to toys that had known too much sorrow. The sun was setting by the time I reached our ranch, painting the cottonwoods in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why Lily had loved autumn so much. Mama was waiting on the back porch, her white hair glowing in the fading light, her face showing the strain of a day spent wondering and worrying. "Rose," she called when she saw me approaching. "And I was starting to fear you'd gotten lost yourself." Then she noticed the extra doll in my arms, the collection of toys wrapped in my shawl, and her expression changed to something between hope and confusion. "What did you find?" I sat beside her on the porch steps, arranging both dolls carefully in my lap while I told her about the morning's discoveries. About finding Mary in the creek, about the abandoned homestead and Sarah's buried treasures, about the letter that explained everything and nothing all at once. Mama listened without interrupting, her weathered hands reaching out to touch Mary's bright blue dress with the same gentle reverence she'd always shown Belle. When I finished my story, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the creek that had taken our daughter and given back this small piece of understanding. "She was always drawn to broken things," Mama finally said, her voice soft with memory. "Remember how she'd bring home birds with damaged wings, or befriend the runt piglets that couldn't keep up with the litter. She couldn't stand to see anything hurting or alone." The observation hit me with the force of truth. Lily had possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense sadness, to find the lost and forgotten things that needed love. A doll, separated from her child companion, would have called to her like a beacon, demanding rescue and reunion with her sister Toy. "She found Mary and couldn't leave her behind," I said, the certainty of it settling into my bones. "She was bringing her home to Belle, planning to surprise me with the discovery. She was trying to heal something that had been broken." Papa appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with more energy than I'd seen from him in months. He'd been napping when I left that morning, but somehow he looked more alert now, as if my discoveries had lifted a weight from his shoulders too. "Let me see this other doll," he said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had grown fragile. I handed him Mary, watching as his farmer's hands examined her with surprising gentleness, good craftsmanship. Someone loved her very much. "A little girl named Sarah," I told him, sharing the story of the abandoned homestead and the buried toys. "She died of fever, and her parents couldn't bear to take her things when they moved away. Lily must have found the hiding place and felt called to rescue Mary." Papa nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without need for further explanation. He'd raised daughters. He knew how their hearts worked, how they felt responsible for the happiness of everything around them. Lily's final morning had been about love, not tragedy. She died trying to bring joy to the world, not running from it. "Audrey, we should bury these things with her," Papa said, gesturing toward Sarah's toys, all of them together, the way Lily would have wanted. Let them rest in the same place. Let them have the reunion she was trying to arrange. The suggestion felt exactly right. Tomorrow we would visit Lily's grave with both dolls and all of Sarah's recovered treasures. We would lay them to rest together, completing the mission of love that had cost my sister her life. It wouldn't bring her back, but it would honor her intentions. That evening, I sat by the fireplace with Belle and Mary in my lap, telling them stories about their respective little girls. I talked about Lily's laughter and Sarah's love of wooden horses, about how they would have been friends if they'd lived in the same time. I described the adventures they might have shared, the games they would have invented together. Mama joined me after finishing the dishes, bringing her sewing basket and settling into her favorite chair. Without saying a word, she began working on something new, a small quilt made from scraps of blue fabric, sized perfectly for dolls. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, creating something beautiful from pieces that had seemed too small to matter. "For their grave," she explained when she saw me watching. "So they'll have something soft to lie on, something made with love to keep them comfortable." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but for the first time in 8 years, they were tears of peace rather than endless grief. We talked late into the night, sharing memories of Lily that we'd been too scared to voice in recent years. How she'd named every animal on the ranch, including the barn cats who barely tolerated human attention. How she'd insisted on saying goodnight to the chickens every evening, as if they were family members rather than livestock. "She's still with us," Mama said as we prepared for bed. "Not in the way I used to hope, not coming home through the front door with apologies for being late, but in the love she was trying to share, in the kindness she was trying to spread. That doesn't die with the body." I carried both dolls up to my room, setting them carefully on the dresser where Belle had lived for so many years. Tomorrow they would be buried together, but tonight they could finally meet properly, the way Lily had planned. I imagined her spirit watching over the reunion, satisfied that her final mission was complete. Sleep came easier than it had in years, free from the endless questions that had plagued my dreams. I didn't know exactly how Lily had died, whether it was accident or misadventure, whether she'd suffered or passed peacefully. But I knew why she'd been at the creek that morning, and I knew her heart had been full of love rather than fear. In the morning, we would gather at her grave with both dolls and all of Sarah's toys. We would complete the reunion Lily had died trying to arrange, and we would finally let her rest in peace. The searching was over, not because I'd found her body, but because I'd found her purpose. My twin sister had disappeared by the creek 8 years ago, trying to heal a broken connection between two little girls who'd never met. Today, Mary had finally floated back downstream to complete that journey home. Tomorrow, they would rest together forever, two halves of a whole that had been meant to be united. The water had kept its secret for 8 years, but in the end, it had given back what mattered most, not my sister's body, but the proof of her love. That was enough. That was everything.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.